Many years ago when I was in seminary, I did an internship for a few months at a church in Washington, D.C., in the Foggy Bottom part of that city. And this was a very, very high church. I mean, I'm talking incense so thick you couldn't see the altar, Gregorian chant, holy water, all sorts of, wonderful, very elaborate choreography. It was a very, very high parish. And while I was there, I went to visit an older woman in the parish who could no longer make it to church, to her great sorrow. And as we were talking about what she missed, she was talking about the fact that she really missed the incense. She said, "Jason, I'm too blind to see holiness. I'm too deaf to hear holiness. I'm too old to be able to taste holiness. But by God, I can still smell holiness." And I wonder if Bartimaeus in our story today, our gospel today, having been deprived of the ability to see at some point in his life, if Bartimaeus nevertheless was able to sense, as Jesus walked by, leaving the town of Jericho on his way to Jerusalem, I wonder if Bartimaeus somehow knew, could feel, could sense that in this man, this traveling rabbi, this itinerant preacher, was one in whom the presence and holiness of God resided in such a profound way that he of all people might be able to restore Bartimaeus' lost sight. The truth is, Jesus had no reason to stop. He was leaving Jericho, which was his last stop, on his way to Jerusalem, which was going to be his last stop. And in every town, every village, every city he went, surely people stood by the side of the road or knelt or sat, beggars and people with one sort of physical infirmity or another, and cried out to him, called out his name, asking for healing, asking for a touch, asking for a word. There was no reason for Jesus to stop when this one particular man from the side of the road hollers out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Of course, the disciples think it's a slightly inconvenient moment. They know that Jesus has his eyes set toward Jerusalem. They know that there he is going to make a triumphal entry. They imagine that there he is going to bring about some sort of revolution or restoration of Israel in independence and power. The disciples have completely missed and repeatedly have misunderstood Jesus' words about his life being one of service and self-offering, and they still perhaps harbor fantasies that there's going to be some sort of military or revolutionary overthrow of the Roman overlords. So they don't want to be bugged by some importuning beggar on the side of the road. They try and hush him, be quiet, be quiet. But he won't be silenced. Bartimaeus hollers out again, and Jesus stops. No reason, but he stops. He hears his name. He hears someone who needs healing touch. And he asks them to bring Bartimaeus to him. It is the final healing moment in the gospel. It is the final moment before Jesus enters the holy city, yes, in pomp, but certainly not to bring about some sort of military or governmental overthrow, but instead to offer his life as an example of service and self-giving to all people. And I don't think it's an accident that the final healing moment we hear about in Mark's gospel is that of a man being given back his sight. Because in a very real sense, isn't that what Jesus' entire life and ministry have been about? To restore our sight. To take away the blindness that obscures us from seeing God and the life that God would give us, that God holds out to us, that God wants nothing more than for us to enjoy and relish. Isn't it true that in one way or another, all of us are blind? All of us have our vision obscured from the life to which we are called, from the relationships to which we are summoned, from the service which is part of the life of faith. Either we have put these obstacles and barriers up ourselves, or we have had blinders placed on us by culture or society, by genetics or history. But all of us need to have the eyes of our hearts open, need to have the eyes of our souls and our spirits enlightened so that we might know fully what God has in store for us. A lot of people, not necessarily in this parish, but a lot of Christians around the world think that once you turn to God, everything is going to be lollipops and sunrises. It's not. We know it's not. The reality is that when we deepen our relationship with God, we deepen our relationship with everything, including the sorrow and the brokenness of the world, as well as the joy and the hope. When we open the eyes of our hearts, we see and empathize and resonate more strongly with the pain and the suffering, with the refugees seeking a new life and safety, with the brokenness in our own city of Chicago, with the neighbor who is struggling with some sort of devastating challenge. We feel that more completely, just as we know and resonate more deeply with the joy, the wonder, the hope, the possibility of love that our lives make. Having the eyes of our hearts open means that everything becomes that much stronger, including our relationship with God. As I said, I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it's incidental that the final healing moment is one where somebody sees again. Because that's the life and the ministry of Jesus and the life and ministry to which we are called as well. There's another dynamic within this story which I know you don't have in front of you to reread because we don't have bulletins. But that is the fact that when Jesus calls Bartimaeus to be brought forward, Bartimaeus casts off his cloak to go to Jesus. Now, to be honest, if you're a blind person, you hold on to your cloak as strongly as you can. And casting it off makes me think that Bartimaeus somehow knew he wasn't going to need that cloak again, or that he'd be able to see his way back to it. In other words, he had not only the hope, but the expectation that God in Jesus would bring about whatever it was he needed in order to be able to find his way back, to see again. He had the courage, the faith, the hope, maybe the foolishness to believe that his prayer would come true. And do we have the hope, the courage, the foolishness to believe that God will work in us and through us? Do we have the guts to believe not just in a pleasant God who asks us to be nice to each other, but instead who can bring about a transformation in our hearts and souls and spirits and lives, that we might be vehicles of God's grace to others? And there's one final moment in this gospel that I think is so important. And that is the fact that we know the blind man's name, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. We don't know the names of any other of the people whom Jesus healed in his ministry. But for some reason, we are given Bartimaeus' name, which means that he was not just an abstraction. He was not just a theory. That the people whose lives Jesus touched and affected, the people whose eyes he opened, metaphorically or in reality, were real people. That God wants a relationship with real people. That God is not an abstraction or a concept, but instead one who wants to be in that dynamic relationship of love, of giving and receiving. Bartimaeus was not just a symbol. He was a human being. We are not symbols. We are human beings with our own aches and joys, our own sorrows and hopes, our own fears and triumphs. And the gospel today reminds us that Jesus came to open our eyes, to open our hearts, to open our spirits, that we might know more fully the joy and love and hope that God would give us, that we might live more richly the lives God has blessed us, that all that obstructs and obscures our vision of God and of each other might be taken away, that from this moment forward we might live more completely the very lives given to us by God.